Like me, you've probably gotten used to seeing political compasses like this one and political compass memes floating around on the internet. Still, I was surprised to see something that looked a lot like them in my political psychology class. What's the connection between these varyingly cringy memes and real science? Well, I got curious and decided to make a video to force myself to figure it out. In the process of finding out, I got way angrier than I was expecting to. Join me for another episode of Political-psych-abby as I explain why. As far as I can tell, the political compass became an internet phenomena via Political-compass.org, which honestly looks less modern than the website my mom made to announce my birth in 1997. But to be fair, my mom is very tech-savvy. Anyway, back on topic. The origins and methodology of the quiz on Political-compass.org are kind of shady compared to other online tests you can take regarding your own values. Their methodology is really opaque. Like for tests of this type used as teaching tools, there are usually keys provided for how questions contribute to scores. And yes, this gets used as a teaching tool. Their own website says so, and also I know people who did this quiz in school. For scales used in academic work, the scoring might not be available to participants, but is typically released alongside any articles. This, however, has the disclosure level of a BuzzFeed quiz. I really hope that the people behind the Political Compass test aren't attempting scientific research with the data from this website, because honestly, their website is so bad and so vague that it would probably be an ethics violation. Fortunately, it would be easy for them to argue they aren't even trying to do science. Anyway, the origins of Political-compass.org are surprisingly shrouded in mystery, but I can tell you that it has probably been on the internet since 2001. The test is operated by Pace News Limited, which is owned by Wayne Brittenden. The website refers to him as a journalist, and I can find some evidence he is a journalist, but not an especially notable one. Almost all sources about him mention him primarily as the man behind Political-compass.org and say little else about him. Let's move on to talking about the test more specifically. According to Political-compass.org, this test defines left and right as dimensions of economic opinion. This is pretty consistent with the way political psychologists and scientists use similar scales. Although unidimensional scales that also put social issues on the left-right axis are common. The real issue comes in how they describe their libertarian or authoritarian axis. To be fair here, this test suffers from much the same issue as the more academic versions of the scale, that being bloody stupid naming. The Political Compass describes the libertarian-authoritarian axis thusly. Party differences tend to be more about identity issues. In the narrowing debate, our social scale is more crucial than ever. In this instance, they mean the narrowing debate about economic issues. I'm not sure that debate really is narrowing. I think maybe it was narrowing more in 2001 than it is now. In which case, they may want to update their website. There are many reasons they should update their website. Basically, what both the Political Compass test and more academic equivalents are proposing is a scale for social issue politics as well as economic. Having a scale like this certainly makes intuitive sense. Still, issues arise with these types of scales. Part of the problem is that most scales of this type also include the role of government on the social scale. Most scales, including the Political Compass, primarily focus on government in regards to social issues, such as whether the government should get involved in people's sex lives or stop them from organizing protests. Problematically, though, I think people tend to interpret the social axis wrong. They often view any amount of government intervention as authoritarian, which it is not according to scales of this type. Also, people view being asked to do anything they don't like as authoritarian, which again it often isn't according to these sorts of scales. For example, laws preventing discrimination are really more libertarian on this sort of scale than authoritarian. These distinctions are very poorly explained on the Political Compass website, and seem not to have filtered through to the general public. One more thing is also confusing. Libertarianism, as it is typically viewed in the American context, means being economically right-wing and socially liberal. In fact, I've definitely seen people make the case that one of the best reasons to have separate social and economic scales is to have a place to put people like American libertarians. This makes it a bit of a problem that one of the compass points is libertarian. I might personally replace the term libertarian as a compass point with libertine, but maybe that makes me sound all French and pretentious, and I almost failed French. Did get to take a lovely school trip to Quebec, though. It's generally not a good idea to have something be both an axis label and something you would want to place on the graph. I'm genuinely not sure why anyone would do this. Although at least one of my friends thinks that in the case of the political compass test, it is to make more people think they are libertarians. There isn't enough evidence to say that this is the intention of the test. However, I would be very unsurprised if the test was highly inspired by the work of J.C. Lester, who designed a similar political compass and appears to be an explicit libertarian, although he is not listed as an inspiration on the Political Compass website. I have seen the libertarian-authoritarian axis used by non-libertarian academics, and confusing nomenclature relating to political ideology is not exactly strange, so to reiterate, probably not a libertarian conspiracy. The three figures who are listed as explicit inspirations for the test are Wilhelm Reich, Hans Eysenck, and Theodor Adorno. This is a bit odd, as these figures were all active a fairly long time ago, hence the black and white photos. And lots more recent work, more resembling the political compass test, has been done. All the same, let's do a brief primer on each of these guys. Reich is relevant as he thought sexual repression, which is a factor on the authoritarianism scale, makes people more likely to become fascists. Honestly, while I don't think it is the only factor, and neither did he, it does make sense. He also invented some quack machinery, which you can see here, to accumulate orgons, a sort of psychic energy associated with sex, so maybe take him with a grain of salt. His belief that the level of sexual repression was the deciding factor between fascism and communism for a country does seem to go against the ideas of the political compass, as theoretically, the political compass should conceptualize an equally, or close to equally, sexually repressive authoritarian left. However, I will point out that in his book, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, he calls Bolshevism red fascism, and groups it in the same category as Nazism. This does make his work align better with the political compass. It also got him kicked out of the German Communist Party. Theodor Adorno did a lot of foundational work on authoritarianism from a psychological perspective. He also called the cops on his own students. He was a complicated man. I will also mention he is the only one of these thinkers I have seen frequently referenced in current academic discourse. However, I would argue his work on authoritarianism sort of goes against the political compass. His primary focus was right-wing authoritarianism, to the extent that his conception of the authoritarian personality is the basis for the more modern concept of right-wing authoritarianism as a set of personality traits. So no, Adorno was not the biggest equator of left and right on the whole authoritarianism thing. Eysenck did develop a set of scales fairly similar to the political compass, largely to prove what he saw as authoritarian tendencies on the left. He also did some totally weird and now totally debunked stuff about cancer being caused by your personality. Also, he did some weird racism and worked for cigarette companies. I'm not saying that his work on ideology is necessarily wrong, just that he doesn't have the best track record of methodological rigor. Also, he often said that those who called him out on his racism were the new fascists, which just yikes. While politicalcompass.org does helpfully name those influences I just talked about, in order to figure out their actual methodology, I had to go off a website I found linked on Reddit that had cracked their formula. I'll link to that website in the description. The fact that this info is not publicly available on the Political Compass website is a shocking lack of transparency for something that claims to be an educational tool. I've also done my own breakdown of the test based off of Wombolo83's work. I'll link to the complete spreadsheet in the description. This is just a glimpse of it. As you can see, each question moves you along either the economic or social axis. Some sections contain a mix of social and economic questions, and some are all one or the other. In addition, how many questions push you in each direction is unbalanced. Neither of these things are inherently bad methodology, but they are a bit odd, and if the scale were scientific, they would have to be explained and justified. Of course, very little of this scale is explained or justified. First off, I want to say that there are some academically respected and rigorously researched measures that use the same axes as the political compass test. However, they don't use the same questions, and there are very good reasons for that. We're going to discuss those academic measures in a moment, but first, a brief interlude of some of the most nonsensical questions from the political compass test. First up, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Honestly, if you had to guess whether this is libertarian or authoritarian on the social axis, you might not be able to. They say it is authoritarian, but I'm not sure what's inherently authoritarian about pragmatism. Next up, there is now a worrying fusion of information and entertainment. The test says that this is a libertarian belief, which is super weird. I'm not sure it belongs on the scale at all. And if it has to be there, I might actually say it is authoritarian, because that corresponds to limits on the media. Next up, taxpayers should not be expected to prop up any theaters or museums that cannot survive on a commercial basis. The issue with this question is the potential to muddy the axes, as museums, their role in society, and their links to the government are hot-button social issues as well as economic. Now let's talk about the statement, multinational companies are unethically exploiting the plant genetic resources of developing countries. This is an axes issue again. Tell me why this question would not make the same or more sense corresponding to the economic left. The statement, some people are naturally unlucky, is just, huh? Also, the most politically relevant thing about luck I can think of is research that suggests if you attribute things like poverty to luck or circumstance, it would make you more economically left-wing and possibly also more socially liberal. So that would be on the other axis or in the other direction. I talk more about that in my video on wealth and generosity if you're curious. So a lot of more scientific measures use axes like the political compass test. Let's look at one of those measures now. So here is a prototypical economic left-right scale explanation from an actually respected academic paper. Also, this paper came out in 1996, so the political compass test could have, used or referenced it. Notice how they clearly explain their scoring system and how all the items are clearly economic. Take notes, political compass test makers. Okay, so now let's look at the social scale from the same paper. Note how all these questions are about social issues and the role of the government. Also note that the reliability of the scale is reported. I should mention more modern research is using similar scales to the one in this paper. The 2016 British Social Attitude Survey, for example, is still using many of the exact same questions. Scales like this one are also used in other countries. I won't bore you by going through a bunch of them. I'd also like to point out that this more scientifically valid and transparent scale is considerably shorter than the political compass test. You see, more questions doesn't equal better science if a lot of those questions are at best untested and at worst total crap. These more scientific measures are also extremely worthy of criticism, but I'm going to do that after the meme review so the video isn't too dry and academic. I'm giving you dessert first. Please just stick around for the vegetables. I promise I covered them in garlic butter and cooked them to perfection. Yes, I will be talking about these memes way too seriously, and literally. This is done for both comedic effect and as a teaching tool. I will also be scoring each meme out of 4. 1 point is given for each quadrant that contains something corresponding to both the economic and social axes. A point is lost if something contained within a quadrant should actually be on the other part of one of the axes it is on. Just so you know, these are not remotely wholesome memes, so I'm going to have to talk about child abuse, transphobia, drugs, and death. So, if hearing about those things is something you do not want for yourself today, you might want to tune out now. I won't be going into a lot of gory detail about any of it, but I just figured a heads up might be nice. Also, just an FYI, most of these are from r/political compass memes, which I'm sure contain some nice people. Let's just say that those people are not the only ones there. If you found this video from there, I thank you for showing up, and I'll assume you're one of the nice ones. But let's just say I am unsubscribing from that subreddit as soon as this video is finished. Okay, finally, first meme, which is about child rearing. So the idea of the everyone getting a trophy bit isn't authoritarian by any indicator I've seen, including the political compass test. In a lot of contexts, I will say it's dumb, but there's a difference between dumb shit and authoritarianism. You'll be seeing that as a running theme during this video. So no points for this quadrant. I'm pretty sure that the right authoritarian quadrant is a reference to beating your children. Valuing the strict discipline of children is something I've seen on a variety of authoritarianism scales, so that lines up. There is, however, nothing economic in this quadrant, so it won't be receiving any points either. The left lib one really confuses me. Is this a reference to bestiality, or is it one of those totally played out jokes about gender identity? If it is bestiality, you could argue that allowing that would be libertarian more than authoritarian, but I doubt many people on the libertarian side of the social axis would actually be okay with it. If it is supposed to be a joke about gender identity, well, respecting people's gender identity would typically fall more libertarian, but there aren't exactly a lot of people identifying as llamas. And you know, that's not the same thing as like someone being trans. I won't go into refuting that equivalency too much, as a bunch of people on this website have already done that much better than I ever could. Anyway, no points there. The lib-right one is actually pretty accurate as far as I can tell, if hopefully exaggerated. The business-oriented aspect makes sense for the economic right, and selling heroin indicates either a low value put on law or an advocacy for drug legalization, either of which could be seen as libertarian. So I would score this a 1 out of 4. In terms of how I would raise my future children, well, none of these options really appeal. Everyone getting a trophy is a bit silly in most scenarios. Beating your kids is very, very wrong and really messes them up. Bitcoin is a massive polluter. Heroin destroys people's lives, and I don't see myself becoming a llama anytime soon. So this next meme is an interesting one. I'm not going to focus on the historical accuracy, as it's not the focus of this video. Anyway, being a nationalist and denouncing sexual degeneracy are both authoritarian on these sorts of scales, but neither of them is really economically right-wing. Also, the Romans had really different ideas about sexual degeneracy than most people today, and also about nationalism, and that is an example of the issues with using scales like this for different time periods and scenarios. So no points for the authoritarian right quadrant. Taxes and trade are both really more economic issues, so no points for the libertarian right quadrant. Giving food to the poor is economically left-wing, but is purely economic, so no points for the lib-left quadrant. Killing rich people so the state can take their stuff does fit with where it is on the scale. It does have the authoritarian aspect of state control that interferes with individual rights, and also would work as economically left if we assume the wealth was redistributed or used for state projects intended to benefit the populace. So a point for that. So this one I will give a 1 out of 4. This next meme is mostly here because I find it really funny. I'm American and I lived in the UK for 5 years. I have studied political science, psychology, and history. Because of the experiences, I could probably give you at least 15 definitions of liberal, none of which are necessarily wrong. Rather amusingly, there are definitions of liberalism that would make every quadrant of this compass correct. Most definitions of liberalism include a fair amount of freedom on private social issues, so that would make both authoritarian quadrants hate it. Then, if we assume the blue-haired guy with the hammer and sickle is a leftist of some sort, then he probably has issues with liberalism, given that it is often defined as capitalist. Theoretically, then, the man in the lib-right quadrant should have no issue with it. But if we view things in the American context, then liberals typically means left of economic center, or at least the center as many Americans see it. Therefore, libertarians, which would be the lib-right quadrant, would have an issue with it. That means I'm giving this one what I suspect will be a rare 4 out of 4. Okay, on to the next one. First, I want to say that I don't like the way this positions all ideologies as equally valid, which is actually sort of a pattern with a lot of political compass stuff. Also, super weird on this one how we encompasses anyone with any political opinion whatsoever. Anyway, on to the quadrants. So, authoritarian left seems accurate at first, but really isn't. State control is on a lot of authoritarianism scales, but that is usually for personal matters, not industry, so no points there. I have some serious issues with the auth-right one here. Valuing religious freedom is not remotely authoritarian. In fact, it should be scored as libertarian. However, a lot of people who want to use their religion as an excuse to discriminate will position their stance this way. So maybe this is an accurate portrayal. Still, I don't think this meme wants me to agree with crying glasses guy. Therefore, due to confusion, I will only be subtracting half a point. The lib-right one is basically purely economic, so no points there. The lib-left one is accurate on the social scale, assuming I am supposed to go off the more normal-looking guy. Castrating all men would be more authoritarian, but I've certainly never seen it on any opinion scale. Also, I guess the centrist one is fairly accurate, although perhaps corresponds to only one axis if you're taking the language very literally. I'm also not including the centrist bits in my scoring system, just an FYI. So this one gets negative 0.5 points. Now on to the memes that were sent to me directly. I want to thank everyone who submitted the following memes. Please do not take my criticism of these memes personally. I am taking them too seriously for effect. Also, dear viewer, please note that all submissions were made by strangers on the internet, and I take no responsibility for their politics or actions. I would, however, still like to thank them again for submitting. If I didn't use your meme, it probably just didn't fit the format for my scoring system, so thanks anyway. Okay, this was submitted by Cookie Cool on Reddit. Apparently he wants a woman's perspective on gym bros. Insert standard disclaimer about how I don't speak for all women here. Anyway, here I go. Let's start with the left authoritarian. Wanting to use a public gym could be economic left, as arguably could be a focus on manual labor and a belief that private gyms are scams. None of the rest of this ones in the quadrant are really political, so no points there because there's nothing social. Moving on to the authoritarian right, eating a lot of Big Macs could actually be seen as a political thing, as meat consumption can have a lot of political and cultural meaning. Like especially if this hypothetical gym bro is doing it to own vegetarians, it could be viewed as an authoritarian thing on the social axis. Note that meat consumption does not make you an authoritarian, more that it could be seen as culturally conservative. Hard work can maybe be seen as a more economically or socially conservative value. However, I would say that valuing hard work is so common that outside fairly specific contexts, it isn't super useful on these scales. Theoretically, claiming not to use steroids could be a manifestation of the authoritarian focus on purity and against drugs, but that would be a real stretch. The rest are not real political. Regarding the libertarian right quadrant, one could view the desire to be the biggest man in the gym as sort of on the economic axis, as a focus on hierarchy and the desire to be at the top of one can be seen that way, but again, that's sort of a stretch. Willingness to use steroids can be seen as libertarian on the social axis, still sort of a stretch. The rest aren't really political. Not sure anything in the lib-left quadrant is really political. A lot of this stuff does seem to sort of play into the unfortunate stereotype of men with certain politics being unmanly. Possibly this quadrant would put less of an emphasis on strict constructs of masculinity, as those can be viewed as authoritarian. However, this lib-left gym bro is portrayed as incapable of achieving this version of masculinity, rather than uncaring about it. Anyway, I guess they'll give this 1 out of 4 because it got close a bunch of times and I'm feeling generous on account of it being a direct submission. As regards the female perspective, well, I don't spend a ton of time in gyms. Before the pandemic, I was a pretty regular Pilates class goer, but those classes were not brimming with gym bros. I guess if I were to just give my perspective on gym bros without respect to the political theory, it would be, I don't know, having a hobby is good, but it is weird if that's someone's whole life and personality. Also make sure to take a shower. No amount of body spray is a shower substitute. Can you tell I had a locker next to the boys' locker room in middle school? God, the smell, it haunts me. If you want an insight into the female perspective on bros in general, watch Season 2, Episode 3 of Tuca and Birdie. The episode is titled Kyle. It is the best possible insight into this topic. This next submission comes from Tiago VF via Instagram. Let's start with the authoritarian left. Well, actually, it gets a point for that square right off the bat, because liberating the working class would be economic left, and putting power in the hands of unelected officials can be seen as authoritarian. While we could definitely debate the validity of criticism in this square, none of it contradicts the axis it is on. Moving on to the authoritarian right, the idea of returning to a society that never existed aligns very well with authoritarianism as it is defined on these sorts of scales. The rest are also fairly good reflections of authoritarian social attitudes, but since hierarchy is described as social here, this does not really cover the economic axis. On to right libertarian. Capitalizing on the opioid epidemic pretty well covers both axes, as do some of the other things in this square, so that's a point. The left libertarian ones are all social things, not economic. Also, I would like to point out that as this meme is formatted with all things listed outside the central circle, clearly intended to be criticism, that means that whoever made this meme thinks that thinking that cultures and people can mix freely without consequence is a bad thing, akin to destroying the planet or worshipping dictators. That viewpoint is, if you'll excuse my language, fucked up. You know what else is fucked up? The way this meme seems to define the perfect political ideology as the one most centrally located on a bunch of axes. I cannot emphasize this enough. The location of the center of a scale like this is likely to be somewhat arbitrary, or, in the case of this poorly designed version, totally arbitrary. Also, while symmetry is a perfectly fine architectural style choice, it is a super weird way to define your politics, especially as where the ends of the scale are is defined by circumstance and by the ideology of others. Anyway, I begrudgingly give this a 2 out of 4. Here's another one from Tiago VF. It's got cute plants on it. I'm sure it won't be even a little bit wrong if it has plants. Let's start with the authoritarian left. So most of these things are economic, although equality can be seen as libertarian on the social axis. However, I won't dock a point because I will assume they mean economic equality. The equally unimportant thing is at best editorializing, and I don't know about the theoretically most productive bit. Moving on to the authoritarian right, these are all social things, except the thing about snow. Possibly, the meme creator believes people with this ideology are more likely to live in snowy places. Christmas isn't authoritarian, but it isn't libertarian either, so I won't subtract a point. Maybe the meme author is referencing the made-up war on Christmas? Moving on to libertarian left. Other than the least attractive thing, these are all economic things. The least attractive bit is probably just a judgment on the people with this ideology, devoid of connection to either axis. As for whether it is true, no comment. Anyway, moving on to libertarian left, defending oneself when not having any attackers is arguably authoritarian, but only if this was done by authoritarian means, such as via government control on people's personal lives or excessive military intervention. I think the meme creator here may be referring to defensive internet rhetoric, which might be silly in many cases, but is not authoritarian. The low productivity thing is economic, but you'd have to be a much better economist than me to see if it makes any sense here. The centrist dead leaf doesn't really correspond with either axis, but does make a good point about the center moving about like a leaf in the wind. Wow, that was a lot of talking to end up at 0. This final meme was also sent by Tiago VF. It actually does a really good job illustrating what a lot of political compass memes get wrong, since a lot of the time each quadrant seems to only correspond to one of the axes. That nicely segues into the very important question: are scales like this even a good idea? Well, the economic and social scales do tend to correlate, at least in some contexts. This can have to do with the emphasis put on equality, as someone who values social equality is also more likely to value economic equality. Jost et al. Have also put forward the theory that social and economic conservatism both arise from the psychological needs for order, certainty, and security. However, the correlation between these scales is higher among political elites and in developed countries. This pattern is more likely to emerge in two-party systems like the United States as well. Honestly, I'd like to be able to argue that it is just a line, because as someone on the economic left, I would like to be able to say that those who share my economic attitudes are almost never authoritarian. I could, with some hesitation, say that about Americans with a high level of political knowledge. However, to apply it globally runs counter to the data. I will, however, say that as I discussed in my video on political attitudes, left-wing authoritarianism is not a cohesive and common set of psychological traits in the same way that right-wing authoritarianism is. Another issue with tests of this type is that they have a defined center where the axes meet. The political center in any given context is subject to controversy and change. For example, a centrist on social issues in 1840s America might think that slavery is okay as long as it wasn't expanded. I hope we can all realize that that's not where the center is now. So there are real issues with talking about political groups in terms of these 4 quadrants. Where ideological groups distinguish themselves is not going to necessarily line up with the lines of the compass. For example, there isn't a material reason to define the difference between libertarian and authoritarian exactly halfway up a constructed scale. We could just as easily put the dividing line here or anywhere else. There are more and less scientific ways to do it, but to some extent it is a matter of perspective. Like, when I announced I was doing a video on this topic, I had a leftist comment that they were confused by the compass as they viewed American liberals or mainstream Democrats as on the right. Now, I don't think that the political compass test would put them there, and neither probably would most more academic equivalents. However, this does raise an important point, because from the perspective of a leftist, or even the perspective of most left-wing parties in Europe, mainstream Democrats are considerably to the right on economic issues. Thinking of things by quadrant can be a real problem, as ideological groups probably more resemble these weird shapes here. Axes on a graph are different than actual political divides. Plus, people often vote for parties that they actually disagree with on many issues. People's ideology is really chaotic sometimes, as inconvenient as that is for political scientists. Really, it is more of a spectrum like this, and I'm not really sure that it should have edges or the possibility of a center, but the true shape of the political spectrum is probably beyond the human ken. Also, this ended up looking more like the Instagram logo than science, so I get why people go with the other one. Thing is, while the graphs academics use to discuss this topic look more like the political compass and less like this admittedly pretty square of color, they do typically conceptualize it this way. A few academics do use the axes as dividing lines, something I disagree with, but more tend to talk about the relative positions of people and groups on the spectrum. In that context, the axes matter, but where they meet does not, so you could visualize the axes like this if you wanted to. In summary, I went into this kind of hating the political compass. You probably got that by now. I still hate it as it appears on politicalcompass.org, but maybe the scientific scales it resembles are a good idea, if one attempts to avoid the pitfalls I discussed and probably a few I missed. Still, though, the memes and the way people discuss scales of this type online are real problems. For one thing, people misunderstand authoritarianism, especially as it relates to the left authoritarian quadrant. A lot of times, people seem to conceptualize a left authoritarian as just someone who is left-wing on social and/or economic issues and too radical for their taste. I know calling people an authoritarian in a meme is fun, but please think of the poor, cringing political psychologists. Especially as if you think someone is too woke or something, then you're actually complaining about them being too libertarian on the scale, not too authoritarian. One thing I've also seen a concerning amount of is questions like this one asking what ideologies the person should look into based off their political compass test results. This question represents a big old problem in the sort of communities that spring up around the political compass test. These sorts of tests should not be used to match yourself with an ideology. You should not choose your ideology exclusively based off of what you already believe. I mean, people often do this anyway, but this is a new level. It is actively saying, I don't want my mind changed on anything, I just want an ideological group. This sort of active closed-mindedness is actually really worrying. I say that as someone who has changed my mind on many political topics, and I'm damn grateful for that. Politics are not Hogwarts houses. You aren't supposed to just find where you fit and feel loyal to that and be proud of it. There are political stances that are better than others. This should not be about finding what political ideology fits you best. It should be about finding out which political ideologies can be used to make the world a better place. Thanks for listening to my rant. I just got a bit pissed off. All right then, moral of the story. A conception of ideology that includes social and economic issues separately is on occasion a good idea when studying ideology academically. The political compass test at politicalcompass.org, though, is still complete crap. If you are an educator, do not use the political compass test in your classroom. Hit me up in the comments for better ways to get your students out of your hair for 20 minutes and have them examine their own politics. There are also a lot of pitfalls to using this format generally, even if we ignore the methodology problems of specifically politicalcompass.org. This format probably isn't the best way to discuss politics online. Allow me to suggest just straightforwardly expressing and examining your own politics. Your ideology is more than a dot on a graph, and so are you. Sometimes academics and pollsters have to reduce you to a point on a graph for study and to compare you to lots of other little points on a graph. But you don't have to do that to yourself. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Do please hit the bell because for some godforsaken reason, subscribing isn't enough to make YouTube tell you when I have new videos. Feel free to comment a political psychology question below. I often make videos based off of viewer questions. If you want more political psychology content between videos, check out my Instagram, which is @Political-psych-abby. Also, I'm finally on Reddit, so if you want to check me out there, that's u/political-psych-abby.